really. And then we decided to add it in some of the saints we kind of talked about before. We decided to add those back in, and I realized those were mostly all in the earlier stages. So so we'll do some cursory coverage of their lives, and there'll be shorter talks on them. And some of the ones that are going to be new to us are more in depth. So we'll talk a little bit about St. Patrick today and St. David. Let's go ahead and get started then.
Okay.
We'll start with our prayer. O Lord, ever living,
ever-loving creature, creator of all, we bring to you our experiences, our traditions, our culture, and our beliefs. We ask you to transform them into us with your wisdom, to be perfect instruments of love
and action
in your world. We ask this through Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Okay. Oops. Hang on. I got the wrong part. This is the first. Let me get back to today. St. Patrick. All right, so good timing. We're starting on St. Patrick. St. Patrick, a lot of what we know about St. Patrick's life, there were two things that he wrote. There weren't books, there were two things that he wrote that survived into modern era that we have from his writings. One's called the Confessio, and one is the breastplate of St. Patrick. And the Confessio was his spiritual autobiography where he told about his life. And so this is the opening paragraph, and it's about 46 or 62 paragraphs long. So it's several pages long, the Confessio. He opens his story of himself with this line. He says, "My name is Patrick. I am a sinner, a simple country person, and the least of all believers. I am looked down upon by many. My father was Calpurnius, he was a deacon. His father was Potatus, a priest, who lived in Banavem, Taberniae. His home was near there, and that is where I was taken prisoner. I was about 16 at the time." So this is how St. Patrick introduces his story of himself. And the way he starts it too, it reminds me of Paul. Paul always calling himself the least of these, and it sounds like a Pauline type self-introduction. I'm a sinner, and the least of all believers. Not trying to take any kind of glory or honor to himself. It's also interesting to note he was born and raised in a Christian family in Roman Britain. It was during the time when Rome occupied the British Isles, or the southern part of the British Isles. So he was raised in the church, obviously with a father who was a deacon and a grandfather was a priest, and fairly affluent family from what we can gather too.
I take it the priests married at that time?
Yes. The celibacy of the priesthood was not until several centuries later. And of course, that was only in the Roman Catholic Church. The Orthodox never had that rule. And British or English, Christianity in the UK, which at that time would have been Celtic Christianity, they didn't follow that either. They didn't adopt celibacy of the priesthood until Rome took over around 800 or so.
That was the stupidest thing.
Yeah,
Yep.
There's
Yeah.
like so many,
I have a question. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, have they had any of these sexual scandals?
Not that I'm aware of. If they have, it's certainly not so widespread or endemic the way it is.
Yeah, they don't hire pedophiles as their priests.
Right. And I think we're, I don't know if either in the Episcopalian / Anglican tradition of any major issues with that. I'm sure with institutions this size, there's probably incidences that have occurred, because if you consider human nature and so forth, there's probably people that have been guilty of those kinds of things. I don't think there's any kind of widespread endemic, throughout the whole system where it's so bad as it is in the Roman Church. And I'm sure that you're right, the celibacy probably has something to do with that in terms of the type of people that are attracted to it. And so, I don't know what kind of, looking at the Episcopalian priesthood, we had to have a class, a couple weeks ago, there was an online class about, it's called,
yeah.
what was it called? Is there anybody else in that class? You were in there, weren't you, Janice?
Yep.
No, Nelson was.
Oh, Nelson was. It was the
What was it? The Healthy
Whole and
Church?
Healthy Church, which is
Something.
about don't abuse people, and whether that's sexual abuse or elder abuse or any other kinds of taking advantage of people, not just sexual abuse, but certainly that's included. How to protect yourself from being in a situation where you can be accused of that or not ever even being in
There it goes.
you could fall into that. And I'm looking, you guys know I'm in this discernment process right now. Boy, that, it's amazing the discernment process for becoming a priest. I don't know how anybody who is a pedophile can make it through all that. Because it's incredibly extensive. At least Episcopalian faith. I don't know how it works in the Roman Catholic or the Orthodox. I'm sure they have their own systems, but it takes a couple of years of a discernment before you even know if you're going to become a priest, because you have to go through all these. Right now I'm in the process of it's called the Community of Faith, where we meet 4 times and have long discussions. We have a 3-hour meeting coming up today with Jen and Janice are both in.
Are you considering becoming a priest?
Yeah, I'm considering
Oh,
a priest or a
I
deacon.
didn't know that. Well,
Yeah,
more power to you.
well, it's a retirement gig.
Your second chapter.
Well, you're a married man, David, so you could become a Roman Catholic priest and stay married. That's the certificate.
Yeah, you're right. That is actually technically correct. But anyway, so after this,
Let's keep them for ourselves, Peter.
Yeah, don't do that, David. We want to keep you for ourselves.
but after this process, then if I pass all that, then there's a meeting with the bishop, and then he decides if the bishop decides I should continue. Then he orders psychological testing.
Oh,
Psychological testing, there's a 6-month internship. So there's all these steps along the way. It's like, I don't know how a pedophile can make it through the ranks to get there. I suppose if you really worked on hiding your impulses and your perversion, you could maybe make it through, but
Or if those impulses had never been acted upon.
maybe so, yeah.
And perhaps the person would be thinking that the rule of celibacy might protect him from enacting them. And
Well,
then
you're right.
later, he would just fall to it. Also, boys who had gone through the seminary where they had abusive priests, teachers, etc., already would have some, not exactly predilection, but introduction to behavior.
Yeah, you're right.
So it's really sad because young children who I talked to a child psychologist one time, and she said, once a child has been sexualized, it is hard ever to erase or to go back to, the state of innocence or the lack of knowledge or interest in these things. And even though the poor little thing was, led into it by some adult, it has also done some shaping.
Permanent damage.
Yeah.
I must say that a lot of this that's gone on in the Roman Catholic is in the past, 20 and 15 or so years ago. Now I start with, I don't think the youth is as much involved in church as they used to be in those days. You probably don't have youth choirs like you used to have and so on. So I think since they've recognized it as a problem, they've probably cleaned up their act a lot. But they haven't rooted out some old people who helped cover it up, obviously.
Yeah, that's the other thing that's disturbing about it. Not just the fact that it was so pervasive and went on, but the level of cover up is just disturbing.
Yeah.
Rather than responding with condemnation and evicting those people from the priesthood, choosing to cover it up is just reprehensible.
See, that they have a habit of moving the priests around every 7 years anyhow.
Right.
So if something came up, they just moved you a little earlier and nobody thought anything of it.
Right. Rather than solving the problem, though, they just move that problem somewhere else to affect more people,
Well, that happens in the corporate world with, inefficient workers as well. Lots of things.
Right.
Yeah.
People get moved on, sometimes with a very nice recommendation to get them a new position and get rid of them.
Yeah, promoting to your level of incompetence.
Yeah.
Oh,
Right.
yeah.
Unfortunately, that's known as the Peter principle.
Yeah, we get that in the government too. We get that.
We know why.
Thanks, Bob.
I've seen people in management positions in the VA where I wonder, why are they there? Because they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, you can't fire anybody in the VA. I have a friend who's complained about that for years. The fact that people sit there doing their crossword puzzles and they're not doing their job and you can't fire them. And
I have to say, the majority of our employees aren't like that, but you do get them. There are some people in there that match that description. That's for sure.
Every institution has them.
So
That's-
Okay, well,
That's
next on St.
absolutely
Patrick,
right.
here we go.
what's that?
We're going on with the St. Patrick, Jen.
Oh yeah, St. Patrick. So anyway, yeah, quite a diversion there. Probably from England, but there's some theories that he might have been from southern Scotland. Some theories that say he might have been Welsh. So exactly where he was is not entirely certain. He was born around 386 or so, roughly. That's the thing is these older saints back that far. There weren't a whole lot of record keeping or documentation. So you gather things from other sources and surmise and make your deductive reasoning and come up with answers. His birth name was very gay sounding.
Going back to previous slide, when he was 16, he was taken prisoner.
Yes.
By whom? By the church? By
The Picts.
religion? Is that what that meant?
The Picts were the next slide to show you where the Picts were. The Picts were a people that no longer exist. They
Okay.
occupied part of Scotland, and they were kind of savage Viking type people. They were known for abducting prisoners. We're going to talk about his deacon and priest ancestors. His mother, Patrick's mother, Conchessa, was a close relative of Saint Martin of Tours. And his grandfather was a priest. So anyway, to your question about where was he taken prisoner? Who took him prisoner? This is a map of the rough breakdown of the British Isles during the 4th century. And you see where Scotland is, it just says Picts. And there were some people that would be considered Scottish up then too, but it was largely occupied by the Pictish people. And we know about the Picts from, and by the way, later in what happened later in as wars and takeovers of other peoples moved on, they were eventually absorbed into the Scottish people and just sort of dissipated and disappeared as a culture. They would have spoken a Gaelic language. There were more Gaelic languages back then than there are now. Most of the British Isles spoke the Gaelic language at that time. And a lot of what we know about them, we know from Roman writings, because when the Romans tried to expand their empire into they had trouble expanding into the British Isles. They actually tried a little bit before the birth of Christ and failed. They were beaten by the Gaels and the British people, and then tried again later on. And eventually made their way in. They couldn't ever make it to Scotland. You know, that's why we have Hadrian's Wall in the northern part of England. So they wrote stories about the Picts. They described them as heavily tattooed, like their whole bodies were tattooed. They were stained blue. They had blue dye in their skin. They're very fierce, Viking-like people. One wonders about, most of what we know is from Romans who wrote about these people who defeated them, and you don't know how much of that is, well, they keep defeating us, so we need to make them out into a very savage people in our writings to explain why we lost to them. So, you know, how much of that is true or not? Because there were no paintings or drawings of them, only drawings and paintings based on descriptions from Roman writing. Regardless, the Picts were a people for sure. We know they existed and they occupied most of Scotland. And they would have raiding parties, and they would loot, you know, steal everything and steal the livestock and kill the villagers or take them prisoner. And the ones they took prisoner, they usually sold into slavery. In fact, Pict is a Latin word for painted. They were heavily tattooed, painted, ruthless warriors. And so these are the people that captured Patrick going down the coast to wherever it was, whether it was northern England or southern Scotland or Wales. They managed to make it where Patrick lived, and they abducted him, sold him into slavery in Ireland. We know he was in a town called Dalriada, Ireland. It was still a pagan. Ireland was still pagan at the time. Hibernia, if you ever heard the word Hibernia, so I have some Irish recipes that have Hibernia in the title. Hibernia was the old Latin word for Ireland, meaning the land of winter. So he was sold into slavery in Hibernia and spent several years there working as a shepherd. And now, according to his writings, around 408 AD, he had a dream. And in this dream, a voice spoke to him. And he believed that the voice was God speaking to him. And what the voice told him to do was it was time to leave Ireland. And he would be provided with a way back to England. So he somehow, I guess being a shepherd, he probably had freedom to roam, and he just took off, walked 200 miles to the coast, and he convinced some sailors there to let him get on his ship. So he took a ship, he escaped, went back to England. And then he was home, and, you know, of course, his family was elated and celebrated his return and relieved to have him back and so forth. But after he was home for a little bit, he had another dream. And in that dream, an angel told him he needed to return to Ireland as a missionary. I wonder how much of that is Stockholm syndrome, but he go back and convert them to Christianity. And so then he went to France to study, went to Auxerre, France, and studied and entered the priesthood under the guidance of a missionary named Saint Germain.
Not germane to the issue.
And he was ordained a deacon and by the Bishop of Auxerre around 418. And again, this desire to return to Ireland to convert the pagans. And by 432, he was ordained as a bishop and sent by Pope Celestine I to Ireland to spread the gospel to non-believers and provide support for a small community of Christians that were living there. And then he spent the next 40 years of his life in Ireland. And according to what I read, he spoke Latin, Gaelic, and French, although would have been a very old version of French, probably actually called Gaulish at the time. But obviously a very smart guy, well-educated, multilingual, probably various forms of Gaelic. There were a number of different Gaelic languages, so which of course evolved into our modern Irish and Scottish Gaelic languages and Welsh. Whatever older versions of Gaelic languages he had, clearly probably more than one of those. They would have, Hibernia or Ireland would have had a different Gaelic language than the British one, at least dialectically different. The story has it when he arrived to Ireland on his return, strong currents swept his boat Irish Sea through Strangford Low Narrows. He landed at Slaney River near what is now called Downpatrick. Church at this site, there's still a church there. This is celebrated as the first Church of St. Patrick, the first church in Ireland. At least the same site as the first church. The king's brother at the time, Dichu, was quickly converted and gave him a barn, or as it was called in Gaelic language at the time, Sabal, which became Saul and became named the Church of Saul. Not to be confused with Paul's former name before he became Paul, but named after the Gaelic word for a barn. So the Church of Saul is the first Irish church, basically barn church. If we know the Gaelic origins of the word. Eventually, as we know, he converted all of Ireland county by county. In his lifetime, established 300 churches. It's reported he converted 100,000 Irish people and consecrated over 350 bishops in his lifetime in Ireland. His most famous writings are the Confessio and the Breastplate of St. Patrick. It's also believed by many that he introduced the Celtic cross, which combined the native sun worshiping of the pagans, which has that circle around inside, the center of the cross. However, of course, we all know driving out snakes was a myth. They also think most of the scholars think that the whole St. Patrick explaining the Trinity with the shamrock was also a myth that came along later. When he was close to his death, St. Patrick says he was told by an angel to return to the place we came from, that is Sabal, so that first church that he started. And he went to that church, and that's where he died in 461, and he's buried there.
What year was he born? How old was he? Remember ballpark?
386, I think we said he was born.
Yeah, right. It was, yes, right.
So he was about 80.
386. 386.
386. Okay. Roughly, of course, all these dates are subject to question within a range of a few years. So yeah, he lived a pretty long time for that generation. So yeah, that church has been rebuilt many times. Most recently, in 1932, to celebrate the 1500th anniversary, which is kind of mind blowing. And there's a picture of one that was rebuilt in 1932 with a commemorative sign on the site.
The barn shape.
The first church in Ireland was built in 432 AD. It's kind of mind blowing to think there's been church going on that site, even though they're not the same building.
Huh.
1,500 years, people have been going to church there.
I think St. Luke's, our church, St. Luke's, resembles that church
Yeah,
with the stones.
the stonework, sure.
With the addition, of course.
Yeah, and it looks great, by the way. We went by there the other day.
Yeah, how's it coming? They got walls up?
The framework,
Yeah, they got set back a week or so because of the weather in February. But they'll catch up.
Well, hopefully when they finish it, we'll be back to in-person service again.
yeah, I hope later this year.
I missed that.
Are we going to get to have cup holders in the pews for our coffee cups now that we've become so corrupted?
Are we going to have to
Good
stand
idea.
up to sing hymns?
I have a question relating back to that picture of the church, Dave.
Yeah,
The, what is that thing that looks like, what is the thing that looks like a silo beside
Bell
the
tower.
church? That's the bell tower?
oh, yeah.
Back that picture of the church, it looks like a silo.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a bell tower.
Yeah, it's a bell tower.
Either bell tower, the store corn in there, one or the other.
Or it's where Rapunzel lived, maybe.
It's got the little arrow slit windows for defending itself too. You can shoot out the windows.
Oh, cool.
Also, that you were calling it Sabal, the barn shape.
Yes.
And I can see that barn shape there. And then of course,
Oh, right,
Jen saw the silo. So,
right.
but that's an ancient Roman archway over the door at the end, the round top arch.
Yeah,
So that has the Roman.
yeah, right.
It's interesting to me, the angle of the roof of the main part of the church is the same as the angle on top of the bell tower.
Yeah,
Looks like.
Yeah.
yeah, interesting architecture.
I wonder if there's.
So David, where is this church actually in Ireland? Do you know?
Yeah, gee, I don't remember. Let's see if I have it in my notes.
Patrick Down,
Oh, yeah, that's right. Which is what it's called now,
Down-
of course.
which is probably
Down.
named for he set foot down on the land there when he came.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, yeah.
You know, it's probably named there. And I was also having one of those read more bookstore moments when you were talking about the Picts and they were covered with tattoos. We've got the word picture
No,
from that.
did we? Really interesting.
Just a bit of revelations.
Yeah, I didn't make that connection. That's interesting.
There's some of those people that still exist. I see them on the street from time to time.
They're coming back.
You should, Rob, you should ask them if they're Pictish. Ask them if they're from Scotland.
I love it.
So on the sign, it says the site is the land of the cradle of what's the cradle of what?
Irish Christianity.
Irish Christianity. Oh, that's beautiful. There's so many beautiful prayers that are Irish Christian prayers.
There are, yes, there are. I agree.
I like the music.
Yeah, the music, the
Yeah.
Celtic Christmas service that we have, right? Is that?
Yeah, I'm glad we include the Celtic Christianity in who we are as a people.
Yes.
I like the Celtic services too. They're very contemplative. And it's interesting, the older Celtic church had some connections with Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox. They had trade routes with them and were heavily influenced by some of their early theologians, the Desert Fathers and so forth. So the Celtic Christianity kind of was a blend between East and West, or
I
is.
don't even think of that.
You were talking about name places. When Kirkpatrick or Kilpatrick, of course, Kirk is a German word for church, and Kil, K-I-L, would be a Gaelic word for church. So you see Kirkpatrick or Kilpatrick, those both mean Church of Patrick.
Okay.
So you see those as last names or place names.
And since he converted all of Ireland, you'll probably find them all over the place.
Yes, right.
I'm run along, get ready for the service.
Okay. All right, Peter.
Hi, Peter.
All right. Well, we'll